Welcome to Tech Out West, where we unveil the tech leaders of tomorrow, today. I'm Paul Mikesell.
And I'm Sarah Lindquist. Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind the startups, the visionaries, and the relentless spirit that defines entrepreneurship in the wild frontier of technology. Hey, Paul, guess who we have on Tech Out West today?
What? Oh, who, Sarah?
What? Hello. Today we have Brooke Steger on the podcast, and Brooke is awesome. You're really going to enjoy this conversation. I think the theme of Brooke's career is just going for it, going towards a place of interest and intrigue where she can grow. And she's done that at a number of Seattle tech startups and working on her own in the gaming space. Today, she's the founder of Yando, which is helping consumers buy land and understand the piece of land before they buy it and build a home. And she also helped scale UberX in Seattle. So she has some fun stories to share. Let's dive in. Brooke, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Super excited to have you here and dive into this conversation. So to get things going, we'd love if you could share a bit about what Yando is.
Sure. Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks so much for having me. I currently run a company called Yando, and we solve the problem with buying raw and undeveloped land throughout the US and actually throughout the world. Real estate agents really don't focus on raw and undeveloped land. It's typically overlooked. And people often find that they want to build this dream home, but once they undertake the process, the piece of land that they purchased isn't what they expected. And so we work really hard to find that perfect piece and give people a really realistic view of what the costs and the risks, but also the benefits are of a given piece of land.
Super cool.
Well, Brooke, you have a long history in the tech community. We'd like to learn a little bit more about where you come from and kind of how you got here. So where did you grow up?
Sure. So I grew up off and on in Bothell, Washington, so not far from here. And then spent some time, we lived in Pennsylvania for a little bit. I was actually born in California, and then I went to high school in Hong Kong.
High school in Hong Kong?
Yep.
How did that happen?
My dad worked in the computer industry. He designed factories that made circuit boards, motherboards for computers. And that industry went to China in the 90s. And so we headed out and lived in Hong Kong, and he would commute into Guangzhou multiple days a week while we were living in Hong Kong.
What, did they speak English in Hong Kong?
I moved there in 1997, so that was the year of the handover going from Britain back to China. So yeah, most people spoke English there, also Cantonese. And then that's kind of the local dialect in Canton in China. And then when China took over, there was a really big push for Mandarin adoption as well. But a lot of people, Hong Kong people were typically very well educated. They had an awesome school system there. So it wasn't atypical for someone to speak English, Cantonese, and Mandarin, even in the 90s.
Was it terrifying when this handover happened?
You know, people were really scared. I didn't know because
you what, 13?
I think I was, I was like 15. For me, it was a bigger deal to like leave Bothell and my friends and go to a country I hadn't been. My parents visited obviously before we moved there, but I hadn't. But I remember some people were choosing to leave Hong Kong at that time because they were worried about what would happen. And I think ultimately there wasn't a lot of change at that time. You know, I think in more recent years, we've seen obviously some like bigger protests coming out of Hong Kong in the last decade. And because things have changed, but they changed maybe a little bit more slowly, and it wasn't as abrupt of a change in the late 90s as they thought it would be at first.
You still have friends there in Hong Kong?
Yeah, it's actually because I went to an international school there. It's been really fun because those friends that I made in Hong Kong now live all over the world. Like two of my best friends married Parisians. And so they're, in Paris or outside of Paris, but some families are still there. Some friends are still there. And then also Canada, like London, they're all over the world. It's really cool.
What did you like to do when you were a kid, when you were going from America high school?
I think the biggest thing is like just the freedom that Hong Kong yielded. It was really safe. I didn't really have a curfew. I wasn't driving. I was too young to drive at the time. And in Hong Kong back then, maybe still to this day, the driving age was 18, but honestly, it's inconvenient to drive there. So just the access to public transit, as a teenager, and the ability to go anywhere you want, whenever you want. And the streets there, like, it's very, very safe there. So it just felt like very metropolitan, but also very free, which was fun as a teenager for sure.
What did you do there as a teenager? Did you go? I mean, I don't even know what you do in home.
Yeah. So, I mean, basic teenager things, right? We would go explore different like shopping centers and areas of town. My dad was like really into going to Buddhist temples. And so we did that actually that was like our religious side. Yeah. And then school was very demanding there, much more so than here. So there was a lot of academics. And then there was a decent like rave culture there. And so we would go to raves at night. One of the first times
you could get in when you were like 15.
Yeah, I think especially as a Westerner, I had a fake ID.
Yeah.
You could kind of like talk your way into various clubs and stuff back in the day. I don't know how it works. It works now. They're probably more strict, but back then you could kind of get into the various clubs pretty easily. Yeah. And then we ended up knowing people in the industry. Like my friend's boyfriend was a DJ. And so it was a pretty fun time, but we were, thinking back, it's like, whoa, you're 16. I can't believe my parents let me stay out so late. But one time I got in trouble for lying and saying I was spending the night at someone else's house. And my parents, of course, ran into that person and they said, like, Brooke didn't sleep over. And then
that's so classic.
And my parents trusted me so much that they were like, no, Brooke would never do that. And then, of course, I fessed up. But then from then on, my dad was like, well, I'll just drive you to these raves and pick you up. And so I would call my dad at like 3:00 in the morning and be like, okay, we're done. Come get us. And he would drive.
Wow, what a cool dad.
Drive out and pick us up.
Could they keep doing raves after the handover?
Yeah, this is all post handover. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, like
there's this huge like cultural lockdown. Well, that's what everybody was afraid of.
And I think that I think that there's been a slow suppression of voice and rights over, the last 2 decades there. And I'm not an expert on that in any way, but I think China, maybe it was on purpose, maybe it wasn't, but that they were sensitive to that. And so they didn't want to come in and like quell and crush voices straight away. And so I felt like it was a pretty vibrant art scene and cultural scene happening in the late 90s there.
Was there a big expat community?
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely big expats, but not just Americans, but you also had people from all over the EU, a huge Indian population there. Like my best friend was from India, people from the Philippines, people from Korea. It was just like really international. So people from all over the world, which was really nice. Mm-hmm. It's a really great place.
What did your mom do while your dad was?
She just played tennis. And my parents even, they ended up having a pretty large group of expat friends, and they partied more than they did here.
So interesting.
My parents were never like huge, they could like have a good time once in a while, but there was definitely more going out, going drinking. They like had a bar that they went to all the time. And I think there was just more freedom too, because as a kid, I have a younger sister as well, but like the apartment complexes all have security, like there's people around all the time. And so it's just a really safe place to be.
Yeah.
Oh. So were you super reticent to go? Like, were you upset to move? Were you kind of, had the adventure spirit and were excited by it, or maybe a bit of both?
I think that moving gave me an adventurous spirit, but I was not happy.
Yeah.
That was when like you could still go to the airport gate. And so there's photographs of me and all my friends crying at the gate. And they literally, we were the last people on the plane to Hong Kong. Like, I think I was screaming, a very dramatic teenager form. But I do think living there gave me, I think academically, it set me on a different trajectory. Just because the expectation was so much higher to be strong academically. Like that was just the kind of vibe. If you weren't doing well in school, then that was like not cool. Whereas here in public school, I found that wasn't like being a top performer was not looked at as like the coolest thing.
Yeah.
And then also just like that sense of independence and adventure. The school I went to, we had this thing called interim. And so every year we would the school would shut down for a week and you would go on a trip. And so one trip we went like kayaking in Nepal through the Himalayas. Another time we went and worked in an orphanage in Vietnam. And those are just experiences that I never would have had. I mean, I guess I still could have had I lived here, but I likely wouldn't have. And then we also traveled just all around Asia in a way that we never would have had we lived here. So I think for me, living there changed kind of my perspective on the world and just how much I enjoyed traveling and how I viewed people and other cultures.
Yeah. Who's that person, Carrie Lam? Right? Am I misremembering this? Hong Kong leader, and there were protests about her because she was supposed to be pro Hong Kong, but she became pro.
I think
CCP, and it was right.
I think the person that was like in charge of Hong Kong, that was more recent, right? Where they were supposed to be
it all blurs together.
Like pro. I think that's part of the change that's happened in the last decade, right?
That wasn't when you were there.
Not that I remember, but I think Hong Kong they called it like one country, two systems back in the day. And I think that unfortunately it's slowly becoming less and less of that.
This is like that theme about like that we were talking about before about the big company that acquires a little company and you go, oh, but don't worry, you're still independent.
Yes.
We love
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. And then you make it feel that way for like the first couple years or like the first year. And then you slowly start absorbing, ratcheting the teams and the founders. Like, do I still have to be here?
Yeah.
And you're like, yes, your contract says you do.
Oh man, that's super interesting. I feel like that's so you're 15. It's like 15 to whatever,
17,
18, 15 to 17 being there. And then how do you feel like that set the steps on your path that happened after that, right? You were now really into academics, had this global experience. So what does Brooke do next?
Yeah, it's interesting because I came back, I actually graduated from high school in Bothell. Okay. So we moved back like during my senior year, which was hard, but luckily I'd kept, like we would come back for the summers. And so I still had a connection here. I think I thought that it meant that I would leave Seattle and never return. And it's so funny that as you get older, you kind of get your roots become more important and being close to family becomes more important. So, I kind of hung out with some of my high school friends in Bothell, and then I realized like I needed to get out of Bothell. And I went to Eugene, Oregon, and I was actually enrolled at the UW at the time, but then I like dropped out and went to Lane Community College down there. So it's funny because you would think Hong Kong would set me up for better academics, and I probably should have or could have worked harder as a teenager. My my 18, 19 years old, but partied quite a bit with my friends from Bothell still, and then went to Lane Community College, which actually was one of my favorite schools that I went to. I ended up coming back and graduating from UW, but I found Lane Community College to be this like really funky kind of artsy, but it's a feeder school for the engineering program at OSU. So they actually had their math classes went pretty high.
Is it in Beaverton?
No, it's actually in Eugene.
Oh, it's in Eugene.
Yeah. Okay. But OSU is, Beaverton's outside of Portland, but OSU is in, now the name's escaping me, but it's like a college town just north of Eugene.
Okay.
And a small town. But Eugene was just like this funky kind of artistic, weird place. Everyone's going to like Oregon Country Fair and working there and like drum circles. And it was really fun. And then the teachers at Lane Community College back in the day were actually like really smart, but also kind of strange. One of my math teachers there I think he had a doctorate from Harvard and his entire home was devoted to setting up computers to find the next prime number.
Oh, wow.
But it was like not a traditional pathway, right? He wanted to do it his own way. And so I thought I actually found the academics at Lane to be really fun and interesting and really got back into sciences and math. And that was always my strong suit. growing up as a kid. So then that prompted me to get into the physics, like getting into physics and math, and then went back to UW because I had dropped out of UW. I was like, I have to go back and finish kind of what I started. I felt like I didn't complete that and made some bad decisions. And so came back and then graduated from the UW in 2006.
Okay. So what was your degree?
Physics, with a degree in physics. Wow. Yeah. It was really fun. And I was going to also double major in math, but I took this one set theory math class that there was like maybe 45 or 40 kids that started. I was chit-chatting with a guy next to me, and I remember him looking at me and being like, yeah, this is my third time taking this class. And he was a math major, and I'm like, oh, it can't be that bad. It was really it was very challenging, and I still have nightmares about that the class because I dropped it, and that set me into like dropping my double math major and then just sticking with physics. But it was such a challenging class, and the teacher was really not into teaching. Like he didn't really like to do office hours. He was much more of like he liked to do theoretical stuff much more than like actually interacting with students. And so I still, like, to this day, I wake up being like, I didn't finish that math class.
It haunts you.
It haunts me. But then I loved physics, and I loved the physics program at the UW.
Was it mostly male?
Almost all male.
Almost all male.
Yeah. I would say it was like 90%, maybe 95% male. And really interesting teachers. Like there's this one guy, and he was the leading theorist on like string and M theory there, and just really smart people. Some of them were really into teaching too, which was refreshing. But I think personally what I found was that I love people and I love being social, and the physics kind of track isn't that social. So I worked in a Raman spectroscopy lab where we essentially like shined lasers into crystals and did readings and reports. And that was the moment where I'm working in this lab and like no one talks to each other. Right? It's just like dead silent. And every day I worked in there, it was that silent. And I thought, like, I don't really want to do this. This is not my calling is to not sit in a lab every day. And at the same time, while I was studying at university, my boyfriend at the time played tons of video games online. And I would get mad at him. I'd be like, why are you staying up all late with our roommates? And like, you're playing way too many video games. And one day he's like, Brooke, but look, I can like sell the items I'm finding on eBay. And I'm like, what do you mean you can sell the items on eBay? Like that doesn't.
What was he playing?
Diablo 3.
Yeah, okay.
Or no, Diablo 3 is the new one. Diablo 2. So Diablo 2. And I'm like, what do you mean you can sell the items? And then he showed me. And so then I'm like, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. So then I started playing, and we would farm all these items, and then we'd put these packages together and sell them on eBay. And eventually I was like able to quit my job. And then as that
were you barista at the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was a barista. That was my like college high school gig. And I was working in this lab too. And then we started selling these items, and, I was never a big video game player, but that definitely, it was interesting. Like, this is not. Motivated. Yeah, I was like, this big worker. This isn't a hard. Like, this is way easier, right, than like having to go in at certain times. And then this game called Star Wars Galaxies came out. Yeah, I can't remember what year that was, but it was like you would go fight various things, and like you could be a Jedi, and you would farm power crystals. And so Star Wars Galaxies, it was a Sony made it, and their first pass at it was actually a really interesting economy from an in-game perspective. And remember, this is before monetization in-game existed, right? Like, you bought the game, some games you paid a monthly subscription, but that was it. There was no buying anything in a game. So I like to think that I was like one of the first people to do that. But we had a really successful business essentially set up in Star Wars Galaxies, and we were farming credits, and we were kind of like, like famous in game. And we were making thousands of dollars a month, which at that time paid all of our bills, paid our rent, put money into savings. And then as this industry progressed, World of Warcraft came out during this time too. And China then also entered the market. So you saw people that were playing video games for money in the US, like prices started dropping pretty dramatically because China really got online. And so now you had like farms of people in China essentially like playing these video games, farming money. So we ended up partnering with a guy reached out to me, this guy named Don, and was like, hey, can you give us, like, bring business to us? And that was for World of Warcraft. Right. And so ultimately we became a middleman, and we would like take people's money and then send the account to China. They would level these characters up, and then we would send the character back. It was amazing.
Yeah. I remember that with all the gold farming and stuff around.
Yeah.
World of Warcraft.
Yeah. Yeah, that was totally us.
The videos of it would be like all these people, and they would wake up in China, and they would go into a large room and start their day, and they would just run around and gold farm all day in World of Warcraft. And gold farming, hunting for gold is like the least interesting thing you could do in that game.
Yeah.
Because you got to like get your pick and you just run around and like hit these rocks and try and not get attacked, right? That's like the whole thing.
Yeah, it was like gold farming was boring, and then they developed bots that would essentially do it for you. And then leveling became a big thing because getting all the way up to like level, I don't know, 60, I think they've changed it over the years, but and it took it was a grind.
Yeah.
And so we had people that didn't want to do that grind, so they would pay us to do that. And then we also would do some specialty stuff where, I mean, one guy paid us $15,000 to get his character to like the top PvP ranking. Okay. So I think we did it. Instead of sending that one to China, we did it for him. So we played it, but
that must have taken a long.
It was a long time. Yeah, it was a grind. Wow. But what's funny is like, you know, to level, I remember getting a character to that level of PvP, you have to be pretty good. And then you pass this character off, and then the person is terrible, and you have to like. I was just gonna say, it's pretty obvious that the character was then sold.
Yeah.
So it was just a really like fascinating. It was a fascinating process. The people who paid money for these things, it was just a weird economy and a weird existence. But for me, what it did is because it allowed me to see that like, oh, I want to run I love to run businesses. Like being able to do. I built the website. It was not good. I think I used a forum, like some kind of weird forum platform. But I built shopping carts, and you could check out and order these leveling services online, and we would do features, and we had a MySpace page.
Oh yeah, MySpace page.
To like promote it. And I don't think we ever did any paid advertising whatsoever. It was all just like word of mouth and, you know, posting on forums and that type of stuff. But for me, it was really cool to just do like the finances and the books and figuring out problems like how do you pay China back in the day. I mean, one day I was walking down University Ave because we would Western Union the money, and I had $30,000 in cash in my bag. Cool. And I'm like walking down University Ave in like 2005 or whatever, thinking like, oh man, like if I get robbed right now, this is really bad. And then I'm Western Unioning like 35 grand to China.
Wow. There were no controls at that time. They wouldn't like.
I couldn't believe that I thought I would for sure get audited.
If you try to Western Union 10 grand right now, like they're gonna.
Yeah. Yeah. Like we did it in like tranches. I don't remember exactly, but no, we never had no one ever came and questioned what was going on or what we were doing, or like who we were sending money to in China. We did actually go to China and we went to the warehouses and stuff. Yeah. And like hung out with Don, who owned a bunch of them.
Wow.
Who was our partner. Yeah. It was really cool to go like tour and see that.
Did you know any of the language from your time in
No, I took some Cantonese lessons, but it's very tonal. Right. And like we talked about before, I'm a terrible singer. And so I find it actually very hard to hear. There's 7 tones in Cantonese.
Yeah, they all mean something.
Yeah. How you inflect, right, it changes the meaning. So I found it very challenging. and so I could do menial things like order or like give directions, but I couldn't really I couldn't speak
Did you
Mandarin.
worry at all when you went over to meet Dawn that this was some kind of setup to like kidnap the rich white people?
Well, I mean, we were not rich. We were living on the Ave at the time in a studio apartment.
Sure.
That was probably like $500 a month above that vintage clothing store. I think Red Light that used to be on the corner there.
Yep.
It was. You didn't shop on the Ave at the vintage
computer lab my whole time there.
And so I don't know. I wasn't that worried. Like I think I'd worked with him now. Like we had worked together for a while that we knew each other. It makes me, thinking back on this, I'm like, I wonder what happened to him. I wonder where I should like look him up and see what happened.
Yeah,
he was I would say he was very fiscally driven. I've always been more like experience driven in my career. Like I want to do cool stuff that's like different and kind of weird. I loved the gaming space because it was like felt very wild west.
Sure.
Like now like they all figured it out and monetize stuff in game, but back in the day it was like very rogue and kind of weird. And so I think that was why I love reminiscing back on that time, because it was really pivotal for me to think like, oh, I like pushing the boundaries a little bit. And then also just like love kind of knowing and seeing what's happening in a business from end to end is really fascinating.
Did you ever do any of that stuff in Second Life? Do you remember Second Life?
I remember Second Life. People made huge. I signed up, but I never like got really into it. But people like bought islands and then subdivided the islands and made huge amounts of money, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm picturing Brooke in your apartment. So what was your daily schedule? Like how often were you gaming? Like in class? Like what did your life look like?
Yeah. So life was very much like wake up, go to school, and then come back, and then usually like my husband, or he ended up being my first husband, not my current husband. And he was my boyfriend at the time. He like played a lot more of the video games, and I was much more of like the admin, but I would play too. Okay. I still played. Yeah. So we would like smoke some weed, play some video games, and then I would do admin. Yeah. But then we lived a lot just around the Ave too. Like, so a lot of your time was there. Yeah. Yeah. Most of my time was spent in and out of the Ave. And then I still had family in Bothell. Yeah. So I remember I did have a car at the time, and I would get broken into so often that I eventually just left it unlocked. I just left it unlocked and like the glove box open. Yeah. Until then there was someone was sleeping in it one night, and I was like, oh man, backfire. Yeah. but yeah, daily life, it was just like going to school, working. Yeah. But it was nice. It was, I think also like some people have that privilege of like not having to work, but I'm almost glad that I was able to pay for and to figure like off of this gaming stuff. Like I think I left college with $5,000 in debt, which is pretty good. Yeah. So it paid for most of my tuition. It paid for all of my rent. And I learned a ton about creating a business, but I think I partied enough in high school that I was a little bit more chill once I hit my college days.
Been there, done that.
If you were doing the admin side and your money literally depended on your boyfriend, future husband, future first husband, getting to a certain spot and you came, I mean, that seems incredibly stressful because you'd be like, come on, you've got to go get a party together to go raid. Like, what are you doing? Like, don't go over there. Like, it seems like it would just be super stressful because the games are not, it's not like do your work and then you get paid.
It's like a linear thing.
Yeah. It's a game,
Yeah. I don't remember, like, while my first husband has a lot of negative qualities, he was very good at playing video games. So I didn't really worry about that. Getting should he have been in college at the time? Probably. Should he have, maybe worked on the admin side, like learned something besides playing video games? Likely. But we also had, I think, the control also went to China in some ways. Like we would have these spreadsheets of all of these accounts that were being worked in China. And then Dawn was pretty good about like updating us and stuff about where it was at. So I wasn't relying on just one person.
Yeah. They should make a movie about this.
I think
Yeah.
so too.
Totally should.
They
Yes.
should. You could do some like cool, I don't know, like they should make it like a Chinese character and base someone that works in one of these warehouses.
Yeah.
Like made a bunch of money.
Cool. I think your whole story is cool about living on the Ave with your boyfriend trying to go to college and
Yeah.
this guy Don in China and running this farming ring.
Running
You're
money.
the main character.
That
Yeah.
story would be rad.
Yeah. I definitely thought, like, I hope we don't get arrested. Like Sony's going to come grab us or Blizzard or something,
Yeah.
but it never happened. We're fine.
Would they do something weird to make it hard to transfer the items or something?
They did.
Yeah.
They did. They were always like cracking down on bots and stuff, which I was always trying. We tried to do things on the up and up. Like Diablo 2 had ways you could clone items and then sell them. And then eventually those items would disappear. But we didn't do that. Even if I think that's kind of the story of my life is I'm willing to like push limits and be on the fringe of things, but it has to be in a moral sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like our goal was never to like rip regular people off to make money. I actually knew a guy, I think it was Eve Online. He wrote a program when he was in high school that made the characters, it claimed that it would make your character naked so you could see your Eve Online character naked, and he sold it. But what it actually did was it sent all of your gold to him. And him and his brother, they made like 80 grand.
Yeah.
Wow.
In a quick stint in like a few months. And so those were types of things that we actually didn't partake in, right? We like legitimately leveled your character. To the best of my ability, tried to make our China office like not use bots and have real people playing. Cause you can tell with computer, like they weren't that sophisticated back then, but I think that they looked for patterns. Like bots weren't as like the way that they moved and the way that they functioned were totally different than humans. And so they would ban botted accounts quite often.
Isn't it? I just want to ask some of the details about this.
Yeah.
So there are multiple servers, right? The whole thing is federated. So how do you get, if you've got in WoW, for example, you've got a bunch of stuff over on this one server and somebody wants to buy it on a different server, you can? Or
you can't. No. You would sell by server.
So you're literally, you have to did you have stuff on every server? Or you
so with Star Wars Galaxies, we had a few, like famous stores that we would run. And then in World of Warcraft, it was we did mostly leveling. So what you would do is, let's say you were like, Brooke, I want my character to be to level 80. I don't want to do this grind, right? Because it takes like a week or something to get of play time to get there. So I'd be like, okay, cool. That's going to be $500. And you would PayPal me $500. And then you would send me your username and password for your character. And then I would send that username and password to China. And I'd be like, cool, China, I'm going to pay you $300 to level this character. And then they would do it. And then once they were done, usually I would send updates, like every few days. I'd be like, hey, your character's at this level, yay, we're almost there. Just like send a little email to the customer. And then when we were done, then I would send it back to you and inform you that you should change your password immediately. And that was that. So we were on your account. So it was whatever server you wanted to be on. World of Warcraft's in-game economy wasn't as interesting, in my opinion, as some of the other ones.
So there's a lot of customer service in being a middleman in this world, right?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Which is funny because then my first job in a startup was customer service.
Was it? So tell us about that. What happened after you got done doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so graduated from college, and then I actually moved to Mexico to be a teacher.
Wait, you got your degree in physics.
Yeah, got my degree in physics.
Yeah.
We're doing this leveling service. I moved to Mexico while we're still doing the leveling service because I was ready to like do some traveling. Went there, got a residency. I was actually like a physics teacher in Mexico for a time.
Did you speak Spanish?
No, I didn't.
That's interesting.
How this
Brooke's just like, yeah.
I think one of my actually like a personal right now I'm learning Spanish because I've lived in multiple countries and I really only speak English well.
Yeah.
And so a personal goal of mine is like man, I got to be fluent in another language.
Yeah.
And I should work harder at it. But I found I'm a pretty, typically I'm not a very shy person, but when it comes to speaking another language, I get really insecure about
That's real though.
what people are going to like, they're going to think I'm dumb. They're going to, I don't know. I think it is
It's very exposing.
Yeah, it's very exposing. And I think it's taken me 40 years of life to get over that. And to be like, whatever, I'll just like power through this and get there. But unfortunately, I did not work as hard as I should have when I lived in Mexico at speaking Spanish. And my ex, though he was Korean, he did Spanish immersion and was fluent in Spanish.
How do you teach? I mean, I get
in English.
statistics,
So the school was the British American school, and so their curriculum, even though it was mostly local Mexican children, their curriculum was half Spanish, half English. And if you were teaching in English, they really didn't want you to speak in Spanish because the goal was they were local children, but primarily like wealthier local children, and so the goal was to have them speak English.
How did you decide to do that?
To go down there?
Yeah, you just graduated with your physics degree.
We did. We went on vacation. My mom, so I grew up in this log cabin in the woods in Bothell, and it was this amazing, like magical place. It was an amazing house. Now it's still there, but there's like McMansions built all around it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like there was like 4 acres, and so now there's like 8 houses in the yard. It's just not quite the same. But my mom had to sell it, and I didn't have any money at the time, so unfortunately, like couldn't help her keep it. And she had sold it, and it was our first Christmas out of this house. And my mom was really into holidays, and so our Christmases were always these like kind of magical times.
Yeah,
and everyone was pissed because it didn't feel magical, right? We weren't in our like little log cabin in the woods anymore. So my mom bought us all tickets. She's like, F this, like we're going to Mexico. And so she bought everyone tickets to fly to Mexico on Christmas Day.
Oh, wow.
So we didn't have to be sad.
Yeah.
Because we all like the beach. And so we flew down there, and I'm like, I'm going to live here. And so we came back, and maybe like 9 months later, we just put all of our stuff in storage. I had graduated from college, and we actually packed like full PCs that we used in our check luggage.
Wow. Yeah.
Now I would just be like, oh, I just have my laptop or whatever. But we also didn't have, I think I had saved up like a whopping like $2,000. We were very bare bones, and
so your goal was going to keep doing this.
Yeah, we were going to keep doing the leveling, and then also we like got residency and got jobs and lived down there for a while.
Digital nomad before it was a thing.
Yeah, it was. That was definitely the goal in my mind. I'm like, how cool would that be to be able to travel around the world and work? Right? Like it was a little early for it, considering we were flying with
full PCs
with like our entire check luggage full of a computer. But
you were the pioneer. Yeah.
So did you buy like monitors down there, or did you ship monitors?
I think we shipped our monitors too. I think the monitor was in there. I think we packed. I think if I remember right, it was like, and like these are like soft packed, cheap.
Right.
It's probably a hand me down from someone I knew, or I don't know, but it was like the like giant PC that we built, that we would build them ourselves, and then probably like clothes and then monitor.
Yeah. It's not even obvious that a CRT would survive the pressure changes of a.
Well, I think they were like still kind of flat back. They were like flatter then.
Okay.
It wasn't like the huge.
Okay.
I think we had some. I think they were like mildly flat then.
So much.
Yeah.
I know. I'm like, now I can't remember. Now I'm like, did we buy a monitor down there? Electronics were really expensive in Mexico at that time.
What part of Mexico?
Puerto Vallarta.
Mm-hmm.
So you went to Puerto Vallarta to teach physics and do gold farming, not gold farming, but like
yes, this is equivalent.
And you spoke no Spanish.
Yeah, correct.
And
It's so good.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it.
On vacation there one time, and you thought the beach was nice.
Yeah,
I love it. So how long were you there? How long
a year. We were there about a year.
Yeah.
And then it was like there was this feeling of like, if I stayed there, it's funny because now we're going back there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like full circle.
Yeah.
But I was in my early 20s or like mid 20s. There was a drive to like join the workforce in my mind. I'm like, I need a real job. I can't just like do these like weird jobs for forever. And so after that, we came back to the Seattle area. And then I applied at like maybe like 30 something startups, all off of Craigslist.
Oh, wow.
I was like, I'm going to work at a startup because of my experience doing the business admin stuff.
Yeah.
I'm like, man, that's what I want to do. Like,
Definitely
I want to like work. I'm going to get a startup job. And so I just started applying all over the Seattle area and finally got one, which was really cool, at a company called Jot Networks. Jot Networks. Jott. And they
double T. Come on.
It was amazing. So it was founded by this guy named John Pollard, who maybe you know him. He's been kind of around the Seattle startup scene, and Shri. And it was a voice to text transcription.
Oh, wow.
And it would be like, who do you want to jot? And you could do it on your phone. And you could say something, and then you would you could jot your Google Calendar and like put a calendar invite on, or you could text someone, and then it literally would send the transcription through a computer program, but then to Ghana, where a human would check and review the transcription and edit it. There was like a big editing platform they had built, and then send it back to you. But we still got some like really bad transcriptions through. Like I remember one time someone jotted their pastor, and it was like, pastor, blah, 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 I have this question, and it called them a bastard. And you're like, oh, man.
That's too good. That's perfect.
It's cool that somebody was like, I guess.
I'm really going to mess with this
I don't
guy.
understand these Americans, but
you bastard. I think that might have prompted like a deeper exploration into like the prohibited, like the words that we wouldn't send.
Yes.
I think it was already blocking some swear words. And then when I worked there, so I was like, they called me the go-to person, but really I was just like the bitch, right? Like they paid me $28,000 a year, and I just did anything. So I would go I would go get the birthday cakes when it was someone's birthday. I did all of their customer service.
oh,
And then
that's tough.
I did their like product. I did some like product stuff for them. I wrote all of their like FAQs. I did transcriber training. It was actually really, for me, it was fun because the company was small enough that I also got to have a sense of like everything that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I was so junior, and definitely like the bottom rung, I still learned and got to know everything that was happening. And I think that to me was like exactly what I wanted, right? I wanted an experience where I kind of got the full like end-to-end vision of a business and what was going on. And so that was there. And then when I was there is when the iPhone came out. And, I think it was our head of marketing. I think he was marketing there at the time. A guy named Doug Ailey. He actually runs a company called Paravision now. I went and worked for them at another company after that. He's a really amazing CEO. But I think he got us featured in the New York Times article launch of the iPhone. And so there was Jot's little iPhone app in there, and we had hired this contractor, Adam Macbeth, who I'm actually really good friends with to this day. He's a tech guy that's been around Seattle a long time, and I think he was a contractor that wrote the program, and no one understood how big the iPhone would be, and it did not work well. Like our transcribing platform just couldn't handle the load, and it was so popular. And I remember coming into work after the iPhone had launched, and we were so excited that we were featured in the New York Times, and it was all great. And we had been doing customer service out of like an Outlook inbox. And there was like 5,000 emails.
And that was you.
And that was just me. And I think there was just this like single tier of like, what do I do? Like what do I do now? And so then it was, well, we need not an Outlook inbox. And so even though it was very stressful, and it was also really fun because now I got to like research and do my first like CRM platform. I didn't even know what that was at the time. So I thought that the experience at Jot was really cool. And they ultimately ended up being acquired by Nuance, which is a huge voice. They do a lot of voice to text stuff.
Did you have equity? Did you get anything out of the equity?
No. So what happened actually is so funny is that I got offered a job at Amdocs, which is like a humongous, really big like back end company. I think there's like 20 something thousand people that work there, for way more money. I was making like 30 grand a year. They offered me like 60. And I'm like, whoa, this is huge dough. And I went and told the founders, hey, like I got offered this job. And they're like, you should take it. And I was devastated. I'm like, why you don't want to keep me? Like, what's going on? So in my head, I'm thinking about all of the, like, that I did something wrong, when I thought that I had been doing a really good job. And the day, literally my last day of work, they called everyone into an office and they were like, I'm sorry, but we're out of money.
Ooh.
And it turned out they had been paying our salaries out of their personal accounts. I think someone wrote a story about this. I'll try to find it and share it with you guys. Yeah. Just how stand up these founders were. Yeah. And the weirdest thing is everyone, they're like, listen, we're working on an acquisition. And we might be able to get you guys all back in, but like we cannot pay you past today. And every single person in that company went back, like just said, okay. And they just like went back to their desk.
Wow.
And kept working. And then I'm sitting here thinking like, I started a new job on Monday. Like, like that's crazy. And that's why they like didn't push to keep me.
Yeah.
Is because, but then ultimately Nuance ended up acquiring them. But no, my stock didn't.
Wow.
It wasn't worth anything.
What a crazy story.
But that's okay.
So then you took this Amdocs job?
Yeah, I took this Amdocs job. And then that job was, it was a big company. And for me, it was still cool to see like the inner workings of a bigger company. I was working on an AT&T account and we were doing taxonomy for like ringtones and games, and making their like ringtone store function right.
Yeah. You could sell.
There was a lot of ringtones being sold back in the day. And then I started working on a telesell account, and I actually was going to relocate to Mexico City. Which is why I married my first husband, is because they wouldn't relocate us unless we were married. But right before I took that job, I actually traveled there a bit and worked in Mexico City a few times on the telesell contract. And then the two of the guys that worked for the founders at Jot created a company called Off and Away, which was a pay-to-bid auction travel site.
Okay.
And they were like, hey, do you want to come work for us? Like it's just them. It was just them at the time. And I was like, yeah. So I was their operations person.
So I pay a fee to be able to.
Yeah. So it is like the weirdest, it's a weird model. So I think it's called like Quibids. They were kind of swoopo. There was like they might have gotten sued and all shut down.
Yeah.
But how it worked was essentially
like this Quibids thing. I saw like ads for it somewhere in like a casino or something.
I bet. Because it would appeal to the same cohort of people.
Yeah.
The idea is that you buy a bid packet, like you buy a pack of bids. Like I buy 10 bids and they're $1 each. So I spent $10. I got 10 bids. And then each time you bid, you spend $1 to bid, but then the price only goes up by like a couple pennies. So ultimately the final price of these items is like $5, but there's been like hundreds of bids.
Right.
So the company is making money off of like someone's getting the item for really cheap,
right.
But the company is making more money than the item.
That's so clever.
Is the model, right? Is the model. There was some
the worst thing I've ever heard.
No.
there were some lawsuits that popped up about it being like illegal gambling, kind of like, are you gambling? Are you not? And there was definitely a gambling nature to it, because when the time started clicking down, like let's say there was 5 seconds left on the auction, then you could bid and then it would extend the time.
Okay.
Right? So like, I put a bid in and like there's only 5 seconds now there's 10 seconds left, right? So what people would do is they would all wait until the last possible minute and then bid it up. So we didn't sell things like iPads or anything like that, which is what Quibids and Swoopo did. We sold high-end luxury suites in hotels. And at that time, this is like the Groupon era, kind of. There was actually a lot of like inventory. There's a lot of unused inventory in hotels of like their higher end suites. Like no one was booking the presidential suite or the 1-bedroom suite. And so there was an appetite from some hotels, and sometimes they would just give us these suites, or we would get them for really, really cheap. And then we would auction them off. And then there was always like never quite enough inventory. So we also became an Expedia affiliate. And then I would go through and I would pick hotel rooms to auction. And then I would get nasty calls from the hotel.
Oh, really? Wait, why?
Like, because they were like, you have our hotel room listed at $2.
Oh, I see.
And I'm like, yeah, but that's not how it works. And then so we always tried to acknowledge and then remove if someone requested to be removed, even though through the Expedia affiliate, like maybe we could do what we were doing, maybe not.
Yeah.
It was a little iffy. And so we would take them down, but people got really good deals. So there were some people in the tech community in Seattle that knew about Off and Away, and they were like hawks because sometimes auctions would just end and there wouldn't be a bidding war, especially for like weirder locations. Like New York would always be really popular, and same with Vegas, but like a all-inclusive in Cancun at like a 5-star resort. There's people that got that for like, they spent like $10.
Wow.
And would get these crazy hotel rooms. So there were some tech people that knew that, and they would come in and get these like ridiculous deals. But Off and Away was acquired by Lockers, which was another kind of infamous Seattle tech.
I don't know about
Seattle tech startups founded by Kathy Savitt. They had some serious funding back in the day. I can't remember how much, but like a really high amount of funding. And then
did you stay there once it was acquired?
I did stay at Lockers. Yep. So we almost got acquired by Living Social. And we were so excited because we were like really, at least the group of us that worked there, we were into like Groupon and Living Social, and we thought those were really cool companies. And then at the last day, they're like, never mind, we got acquired by Lockers. And we were all like, oh, okay.
Nice.
And so we went, and you know what, honestly, though, even though at that moment we were disappointed, and they were only one block down from us in Pioneer Square. So our office was like on Jackson and they were on King. And so we just wheeled our chairs with all of our stuff on it to this new company. And it was an acqui-hire, right? Like they were hiring us because we had some like really awesome engineers that worked for us. And that was essentially why they bought our company, not because they were continuing the pay to bid auction. And I make fun, but honestly, at that company, they had a lot of resources, quite a bit of money, and they had absolutely like no data infrastructure. So they weren't reviewing but they really weren't reviewing much data at all. And so for me, it was really fun to come in because they had like, I don't know if you're familiar with like a Vertica database.
Yeah, sure.
And they had spent, I don't know how much money putting this Vertica database together, which is pretty powerful.
Very
and like,
cool. Yeah.
they weren't using it.
Yeah.
And so I got to like learn VSQL and like build out their database. And then I started doing all of their dashboard, like their company dashboards and all of their marketing analytics. And so there was just like a huge opportunity there. And I got to learn so much because they had literally zero reports. And so I did the company reporting.
How do you spin up a Vertica database and not have a plan for what you're going to do with it?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the steps were previous to what happened.
It's a very purpose-built database. It's built for reporting. It's built for it's a column-oriented data store. It's built for like sensors reporting is what it's built for,
But they literally had nothing they were doing with it. And I don't know
whose idea this was.
I don't know if someone knew someone who sold, like knew the salesperson or something.
Yeah.
Like I have no idea what happened, but the infrastructure was all there and like zero, it was not being used whatsoever. So for me, it ended up being like a really cool job because I got to do, again, I think going through these startups, like it's just such an amazing pathway because you get to do a bunch, like no one would hire me to build reports off of a Vertica database if I didn't have experience doing that. If I was going to go work at a larger, I would never be qualified to go do something.
What does this company do?
So, Lockers, they had a lot of different business models that they cycled through. When we joined, they were like, it was really popular amongst like younger kids, and you would like do things on their site to earn points. That is PTZ, points.
Yeah.
Points.
Points. And then, sorry, I'm like kind of remembering in my head what the company actually did. And then they had like a shop where they would sell clothing.
Huh.
But I think they used to sell lots of PlayStations, and there was an extreme amount of like weird things that happened where people would farm points and then get these free PlayStations. But that was before we entered. That was before we were hired in. And so when we were hired in, they had pivoted to like this like, you would like watch movies and get points, and then you could use that for discounts on clothing.
Huh.
And then they wanted to make it like Pinterest kind of. And so then they had then there was like some social content happening at the time, but they also owned this like really large photo sharing platform for Twitter. Because I think back in the day, you all photos were hosted off of Twitter. And so they also purchased this huge photo sharing site. So their traffic numbers were ridiculously high, but it wasn't necessarily traffic that was coming through the actual core products. Anyway, it was a bit weird. And then I think they were acquired by a Chinese company.
Okay.
And then fully rebranded and then ultimately shut down.
Okay. So you were there for how long? And then that happened before you went on to the next thing?
I was maybe there for a year or less. It wasn't that long. It was interesting.
Well, it is so interesting. I know you said this earlier about how your interest in consumer businesses and how you've just kind of hopped, from gaming, all these different worlds. And there's been a gamification element that's been involved in all of it.
Yeah. It was kind of, it's definitely for me, like I love consumer products. I think it's interesting to see, because I like data too, right? It's interesting to see behavior. And I think behavioral data becomes really interesting once you have larger consumer products. And I love the data behind marketing as well. I've always loved being proved wrong, where you think, oh, this is like a terrible marketing effort. Like this is so stupid. And then it just blows up and you're like, I had no idea what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Even when I was at Jot Networks, we had a Twitter link and you would be like, who do you want to jot? And you'd be like, Twitter. And not the whole company, but a lot of people in the company, we were actually bigger than Twitter at that time. And Twitter, I think, built the Jot link because we had an API and we were like, who would use Twitter? So stupid. So I love even though it shows how maybe sometimes I make the wrong decisions, it's really fun to be proven wrong sometimes. Totally. And I think with consumer products, there's kind of a fun piece of that.
Well, 100%. So then after this, was it Uber next? Okay. Yeah. So walk us through that story, because I know you have some fun anecdotes of being proven wrong and
Uber is like its whole own beast, right? Yeah. So it was actually well, tell
us about the story about how when you first were captivated by it, right?
Yeah. So I was out on Halloween, and Seattle has had a taxi supply problem for a really long time. Also a safety issue. I've been in a taxi where, not safety, but like they drove me to an ATM to pay. Like, oh, I don't take credit cards. Like I'm going to stop at this bank so you can like take money out so you can pay me in cash. And my friend, actually, she was in a taxi in a yellow cab in Seattle, and the guy was reaching around trying to like grab her and like wanted like, come home with me, blah, blah, blah. And she ran out at a red light because it was so scary. She just like ran out of the car and called yellow cab, and they're like, we don't, they had no way of tracking who the driver was. And so those things were all like, I think many people had experiences like that. And then on Halloween night, I had been out, of course, like partying a bit. I'm in my late 20s, and I tried to call a taxi, and I had been on hold for her yellow cab for like 45 minutes. And I was at a friend's house, but I didn't know her address. And I get the operator, and she's like, yellow cab, where are you? And I'm like, and she clicks. And I'm like, no, I just waited on hold for 45 minutes. And then I remembered that actually Michael Walton, who was my boss at both Jot and Off and Away, excuse me, had told me about Uber. And so I had a BlackBerry at the time, and I texted my address to Uber, and a black car showed up, and a guy opened the door for me, and he handed me a bottle of water And I got home and I didn't have to pay. Like, it was automatically paid through that wasn't an app. It was just like through the platform at the time. And it was amazing. And it was like the most magical kind of technology experience I had had in a really long time. And so I'm like, I have to work there. Hold on, take a drink.
Yeah. Well, I love this. This is so fun.
That's amazing. Yeah.
You have the best story, Brooke.
A lot of people went to Uber because they had experiences.
Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember it?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I remember trying to go to the airport, and the same thing. Like, the cars call, the cab's coming, but then the cab's not coming.
Yeah.
And they pick somebody else up, and then you miss your flight, and it's like a bunch of crap.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, it was like really common. I think it was really common in San Francisco too. Similar experience.
Seattle and San Francisco, yeah, definitely.
Where they had suppressed, suppressed taxi supply to the point that, like, you just didn't, like, that was just ripe for that, right? And so, and Uber was just Black Car at the time. Seattle was Uber's third city. And then I'm like, man, this is really magical. And then they had a GM position post for Seattle.
Where?
I mean, they posted on their website.
Oh, okay. Not Craigslist.
Not Craigslist this time.
No, not Craigslist. They, I think we moved. Craigslist now is quite scary for jobs. Yeah. But yes, like I'm like, I really want to work here. I had been watching their jobs. The GM role posted. I didn't know if I was quite qualified for the GM role, but I'm like, I don't care. I'm gonna get this job. And so I started. Uber was a really like on the ground. They did a lot of on the ground events, so I started just going to all of them.
Because there hadn't been a GM yet. Like, what was?
There was a GM.
Oh, there was, yeah.
And then I don't think it worked out. She was I think she's was a very smart, capable person. But I think they were still honing in their GM profile. And
I remember this. She was the first person.
She was the first GM.
Seattle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, and it just didn't work out. I think she was like more of a marketing profile.
Got it.
And they found very quickly that like they wanted you to have like marketing aptitude, but like also have be a little bit more like operations focused.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was the second GM. And so when I was hired, there were 2 people on the Uber Seattle team at that time.
Yep.
There was Black Car, and that was it. And like I was effectively hired to go to launch UberX in Seattle. And I really think that my time being the video game, I think they were excited that I was willing to like push legal boundaries. Maybe in a way like that I was comfortable with doing something that was like it wasn't a clearly legal.
It's an interesting story because they're pushing these legal boundaries, but clearly the people wanted it.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, well, what does it mean to push a like a gray legal area where all of the people that would be customers, actually both sides of the market, are very much in favor of it. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think this is in theme with your doing things that are morally correct, even if it's a gray area in some sort of like technical.
Yeah. It was really interesting because I never worked in any kind of regulatory capacity or thought a lot about like local versus like city versus state versus federal regulations. I mean, that was not my world or space at all. And this was like a very interesting jump into understanding like how that all works, even like writing some regulations for better or worse. And it was. So
you just applied to this job on the website.
Yeah, I applied. I applied to the job on the website.
Did you interview with Travis?
I did.
Yeah.
I had no idea. So luckily, I was very prepared for the interview, but I didn't I had no idea who Travis and Ryan were. Okay. Didn't know who they were, right? Didn't care. Yeah. So that was the attitude I went in with, which I think kind of helped my interview. Because when I showed up, so first so they make you do this deck where you plan, you did a city plan for the next 90 days. And I probably wouldn't have been hired had I applied for that job 6 months later, because reflecting back on my deck, it was maybe the content was good, but very not pretty. I didn't go to business school. Like, I've never been like a highly polished person.
Yeah.
And so I just like marched in there with my deck and I was like, here's all the things you guys suck at. Like, what is this New Year's surge thing? Like, look at all, and they were just like cracking up. And yeah, I interviewed with Travis and Ryan in the glass there. His office was a glass box in the middle. And so everyone's looking at you, and it was very weird. And so of course I show up for the interview and they're like, oh, we changed the time. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, okay. So I just like went and sat across the street for like 3 hours, just like getting stressed out. What year was this? 2011. 2011. Wow. Yeah. And then I went in and I interviewed, and like, honestly, the interview was it was actually a really fun interview. There was like a lot of laughs. It was like kind of stressful, but pretty fun. Like, it felt very, I really liked Travis and Ryan. I thought that they were really nice guys. And then all of a sudden Travis just stands up and he's like, I gotta go. And I'm like, okay. And he just leaves, you know? It's like, okay, cool. So is that good or bad? I don't know. And then Ryan was like on, I think they were using HipChat at the time or something. And then he kind of asked me a couple of like random questions. And then he's like, okay, cool. You got the job.
Yeah.
Outstanding.
And I'm like, what? Like, whoa. And I'm like, great, I'll take it.
Yeah.
I don't even think, maybe I negotiated a little bit. I don't think I even cared. It didn't matter. And so they hired me on the spot. Wow. And it was like an amazing, like, I feel like I got lucky in some ways, because I've heard that that interview process was really rough for some people. But I also, like I said, I think it helps that I did not look up. Like, I had no sense of who Travis was before I went in. I didn't really because I didn't live in San Francisco. I also think the mystique of Uber. I actually went to drinks with an old friend that night, and he's like, holy shit, Brooke. Like, do you know what the job you just got? And I was like, yeah, it's going to be like really cool. He's like, no, don't you understand? And I was like, I don't no, and then I had other friends that were like, Brooke, you have so much promise in your career. Why are you going to work for a taxi company? You know?
Mm-hmm, of course.
So it was because I didn't live in San Francisco and I wasn't super connected in San Francisco, I didn't understand like how big Uber was going to be. But at that time, Travis and Ryan definitely knew. Yeah. They knew how big it was going to be. I just was like,
I love this.
Just like, this is really cool. I want to work here.
Yeah.
So they gave you the job in the interview, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think he was messaging with Travis.
Oh, I see.
Reflecting back, I think they were like,
they were messaging about.
They were messaging back and forth. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have to stand up at all during your interview?
No, but I definitely have had some like pacing meetings with Travis in my life.
Let's just do that. Stand up and march around the room.
Yeah. Just pace back. Yeah. Make you, or he liked to like walk and meet, right? Like just pace around like laps around the office meeting.
Sit still. Yeah.
Yeah, he was not big in his sitting. He wasn't like a sit-still guy.
So they were like, okay, you got the job, but then did you have an office? Did you know what was your plan? What was your tactic?
Yeah, so this is really great. So they're like, you got the job. And I was like, cool, but I'm going to start like after the new year is what I told them. And they're like, okay, you know, because I think it was like kind of November maybe. So I'm like, okay, cool, I'll go have like I need to quit my current job, and then it'll give me like a week and then I'll start. So there was an office. There was 2 people in it. It was like in Capitol Hill. And then I got my own office, which was like my first time ever having having my own office. And it was like the most hilarious own office in the world. It was like half storage unit. It had a door, but like it didn't really work.
It's still my office.
Yeah, I think I didn't know. I had no idea what I was getting into. I just had no sense. I was just like going along for the ride. I showed up. And then actually the weekend before I started, Travis called and he's like, hey, I'm in town. And I was like, oh, I'm out of town. I'm in Whistler with some friends. Like, bummer, I'm going to miss you. And I remember him being like, what? You know, I think he maybe expected me to like cancel, or I don't know. But I was like, oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm not in town. I'll catch you next time, you know? And I didn't, you know, I think I've just like lived my career in like a happy, naive world of where everything just kind of works out. You know, and it did. Like I definitely felt overwhelmed when I started the job. I definitely had imposter syndrome too. There was a GM summit very quickly after like a couple months into starting, and it, like, the GMs were just like this amazing group of extreme high performers that all went to like not all of them, but many of them went to like really fancy business schools and had these like huge jobs, you know, and I'm just like, yeah, okay.
Here I am.
Here I am. And I remember during that GM summit, there was a huge amount of talk of local versus centralized scale, right? So I think there was a guy named Simon from Expedia who was on the board at the time. I don't know if he was on the board or if he was like an advisor. And then another guy who ran Booking.com. And so it was like, you had this executive from Expedia, you had this executive from Booking.com, and they were both the two biggest travel companies in the world, but they had very different perspectives on how that scale would roll out. Expedia did a lot of on the ground stuff, and Booking was all mathematicians running their ads, and they had no one locally. Like, there was no one on the ground, and so it was I just remember being overwhelmed by the amount of information, but also just being really privileged to like be in the room as the company started to think about, you know, hyper local operations, and then also what that would look like down the line. I mean, ultimately in that moment, they were deciding to double down on local, which Uber did a really good job of, right? They hired scrappy GMs to run with crazy operations on the ground. And I think it really paid off for them. And from a scale perspective, I don't know. I think there probably could have been things that we did better transitioning to the centralization than we ultimately did. And I think that was a really hard process for Uber. But you ultimately need to, right? Like, you can't have 400 marketers on the ground all doing different things across the country. It doesn't work.
Yeah. So how do you find new? This is before UberX. So you're trying.
Yep.
How do you find new? Because it was always a supply problem, right? How do you find new?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for us, I wasn't as worried about supply for Black Car because we were so focused on what does an UberX look like in Washington state. But yes, I mean, it was always a supply. Like, Uber had the blessing of finding product market fit like that, and there was a huge like latent demand for it. And so for me, like, my big task was to figure out like, what does UberX look like in Seattle?
So you launched UberX.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like, there was, and we were looking at it from like what regulatory umbrella are we going to put this under? How are we going to try to interject? And what do our conversations with regulators look like? So I was spending a lot of time, you know, reading regulations, talking to regulators, or not talking to them. They weren't really like, we weren't really promoted to like go talk to regulators, you know? And then also just, you're right, that like even just with Black Car, trying to get some more supply on the road. I think we had at that point reached out to like every single limo company that existed. Luckily, because there was more demand, you saw people purchasing town cars, right? So you had people who might have driven taxi in the past, and how taxi worked was that you essentially, if you owned a medallion, that was a different thing. But most drivers didn't own a taxi medallion. Most drivers were paying a lease fee for that taxi. So what you would do is you'd come in the morning, and then you'd pay either a weekly or a daily rate for that taxi. And then you would, whatever you profited over that rate is what you would take home. But you were paying for gas, you were paying for this, you were leasing this car, and sometimes they wouldn't make money, you know, because the dispatch systems didn't work very good, and you had to be more strategic about your location. And if you weren't very strategic and you just sat at the airport, you know, there was a lot more drivers too than there were taxis. There was just more people looking for work. So you saw a fair amount of people go out and just start buying town cars. to put them on the platform. So that started to grow supply. And then with UberX, Sidecar was operational here. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
They were like the kind of like gangsters that like rolled out. And they had those like weird orange covers on the side. And then Lyft was in existence, but not present in Seattle at the time. And so we were talking to regulators being like, hey, like Sidecar's operating. Can we operate? And then Travis wrote this big white paper about tacit approval. Like essentially like if you're not going to do anything, then we're just going to launch. And that was written. So like that publishing was then the cue to like that we were going to launch Seattle. So that was like kind of part of Seattle's launch plan in a way. And we launched Seattle. And I think Lyft launched right around that time as well in Seattle. And we just like we made up our own vehicle inspection process. Like we just made it all up. You know, we're trying to make it like as safe as possible. But literally you had Bryce Bennett, who's the CEO of Solo now, and me, and like he had been hired by that time. He was hired around the same time as me. We were like with a little clipboard and we're circling a Prius and we're like, turn your blinker on. And we're like, check, it went on.
Yeah.
You know? And so we just like made it up. Like, cause we felt that if we had processes in place, I mean, at least we looked at the car, right?
Yeah, sure.
And the drivers were background checked at that time too. You know, were the systems working as well as they do today? Like I think actually Uber probably single-handedly helped improve the automatic background check system in this country because of just the amount of background checks that they've done over the years. But you know, we just like made up these processes, and we also spread a rumor that you had to have a black Prius to be on UberX, even though Travis wouldn't allow us to lock down. He was like, no, you can't be that strict about your
vehicles,
which is fair, like a supply problem, also a control issue, right? But then a lot of people went out and bought black Priuses. And then everyone who already owned one got really pissed at us because random people just started getting into the back of their cars, being like, what are you doing in my car? And they're like, aren't you my Uber? But we did it, right? We launched it and it was insanely popular.
There's a huge amount of logistics, right? You got to get, because it wasn't, Uber was supplying the phones at that point. You need to get like a driver ops center. You need to like,
I forgot about the phones. Yeah. And we did that out of the office in Capitol Hill. I mean, it was like we met every single driver personally, you know, and it was all hands on deck. And I think too, when I first started too, it was after a New Year's where literally the entire system went down and they were manually trying to record trips. I mean, it was like, it was crazy out there for sure. Like the tech stack was not nearly what it is today. And like, it was kind of madness, but yeah, we were handing out phones, teaching people how to use them.
Okay.
You know, GPS wasn't even as good as it is today.
Right.
It's like very different process. But yeah, drivers would like line up around the block to come into the office. And so there was a lot of logistics, even just like managing drivers.
So you'd come into work in the morning and there'd be a line of people waiting to get on the platform or had a problem with something or needed help.
Have a question. Yeah. And I mean, especially in Seattle, the driver base is very East African, right? So you have like Somali, Eritrean, and Ethiopian, and they're very in-person culture as well.
Interesting. Yep.
And so I think that was actually like a growing theme at Uber. There was I think there was quite a bit of tension. I was definitely in the camp. I was like a long time in-person camp where even when there was a desire to pull in-person support for drivers later, you know, many years later, I think just based on like the cultural diversity and also like language restrictions that many drivers have, they might be able to speak English decently, but their reading comprehension is much lower. It just is so interesting because Uber was such a physical in-person company, not only for the customer, obviously a physical experience for the customer, but the partners themselves like needed a lot of hand holding in many cases. which is kind of crazy.
What's the craziest thing you remember about that time that you can talk about? Maybe?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I don't like there's like, I think some of it is just the sheer risk that was assumed by putting UberX on the road. I don't think Uber had, I think maybe it was closing its $250 million round. Insurance was a massive question at that time. And so I think there was an assurance program, but I don't think their James River policy was in place yet, which is like huge. I mean, I remember my now husband, my then boyfriend, luckily he stuck through it, which he almost didn't a few times, but he did. We were out to dinner, and I, like, my phone's like ringing off the hook, and it's Travis and Ryan both calling me, like they must have just talked, and someone was tweeting that they were in an accident, and you think it's like, it was just a little fender bender, right? But those little teeny accidents back then were a really big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And so just the fear of something bad happening. Right. And like, I think back to those times and I think, man, like it was really great. It was just crazy. Like the amount of risk was huge, but they were willing to take it. And I think that's what needed to happen to kind of like open up the market and change really the face of like transportation in many ways. By being willing to take those risks, but they did freak out about them behind the scenes. That's why I'm like, this date is over and now I'm going back to work, but just like the phone shipments that we would get, like the drivers one time, there was the culture, the driver culture too, and just interfacing with the driver culture. I remember one time, Bryce is going to kill me for telling the story, but he was like paid, like someone paid him, like he was trying to like give him money. Like he didn't want anything then. He was just kind of like greasing the wheel for like future asks, and like Bryce kept giving the money back and the guy kept like sliding it back to him. And finally, I think Bryce brought me this like $100 bill and was like, Brooke, I don't know what to do. Like he just keeps giving it to me. So I think I sent it back to him or something like in the mail. I'm like, fine, we'll just like send it back. But just facing those like really weird, like at Uber, then you just like write a playbook for it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end and then you'd move on. But like, there was like always some like weird, crazy thing that would happen.
Share a bit about what the dynamics were like with the city of Seattle too, as you were doing this.
Yeah, so they were pretty bad.
Yeah.
I don't think they started necessarily bad, but I think like you hire people like me, right? I think I was 30 at the time, right? I didn't have any experience with politics, very altruistic in my vision. We all drank the Kool-Aid, right? Travis did an amazing, he was, in my opinion, he was such an amazing CEO when Uber was a smaller company, right? Like, I think that there were some scale struggles later, and like cultural struggles later on. But when it was like rocket ship taking off, like building the plane while flying it type thing, like he was really, really a good CEO. And we all believed in him like we followed what he said and like believed in those visions. But I think Travis fundamentally like did not trust the government. And that was just, I don't know why, but I think that he gave off that air. And so that was then transferred down to the GMs. And so instead of, I think, if I were to do the same thing again, I probably would be a little bit more collaborative in my approach in working with the city. That being said, if you take that approach, it might have taken 10 years longer and might have never happened. So I actually think Travis was really smart. Like, hire a bunch of really young, hungry people who don't care, like don't care, right? To that they have a goal and they're going to accomplish that goal. And so we were pretty aggressive with the city, right? I think seeing the inefficiencies, we believed very firmly that like a better system needed to be in place. And if you looked throughout what had happened at the city of Seattle, I mean, like it was ridiculous that new taxi licenses hadn't been issued in like a decade or something stupid. It was just crazy. Like they had no the concept of supply and demand and like growing a healthy downtown core. Like it just wasn't a focus of the city or the state really. And I think it showed in a lot of their legislation. And people worked really hard to protect their taxi medallions. So, when we went in to like upend that, I think I went in with a very data-driven perspective, and it was very frustrating for me as a young person. Having that data rejected was mind-boggling to me because I thought, well, it's kind of black and white. Like, obviously, there's this demand. Why wouldn't you want to bring supply in line to meet that demand? There's all these like Lyft, Sidecar, and Uber are all operating, and we're doing all these trips. Like, why would you not want to? And there was just so much resistance to even wanting to talk about it. We don't want to deal with it, right? And there had been some political, so you had Yellow Cab, which was a big political player. You had a group called East Side for Hire, that was a group of Somalis who they had ruffled the feathers of Yellow Cab so much that actually the city of Seattle created these like flat rate for hire licenses. So they had created some more, but that was them fighting, who I'm actually still friends with the guy that started that whole thing. We used to fight and now we're still in touch. And then you had the Teamsters, which was a voice in this whole thing, the Teamsters Union.
Oh, why? What were they?
They had been trying to organize taxi drivers for a really long time.
No idea.
So the Teamsters actually, I would say, were like, to this day, Working Washington then came in, which is also like a union adjacent kind of advocacy group. But the Teamsters, I mean, the reason for Uber's long-standing political turmoil at the city of Seattle, I mean, behind the scenes, it was like all Teamsters the whole time, creating that at the city. It wasn't, they claimed it was about what was best for drivers, but I think that you can tell by the legislation that's been passed, it's not really about what's best for drivers. It's really about Uber and the Teamsters. Now it's about them negotiating for what's best for each of them. And unfortunately, the drivers have kind of been like, they get picked up in some of it sometimes, but it's tough. So early days with the city of Seattle, it was really just about us pushing really hard for them to just let UberX operate in a legal sense.
How do you even know who to talk to?
Yeah, and you just kind of go and start asking for meetings with all the city council people, right? Because they ultimately vote on new legislation.
Through email or calling? You walked down
Show
to
up.
City Hall?
Yeah, so at first we didn't hire lobbyists because we're like, we'll just do it. Yeah, so then you just we would just email them and ask them for meetings. And then eventually we hired a lobbyist who would set up all that stuff for you. But they were just like not very responsive. And to this day, there were still some city council members who, because I worked for a company, they refused to meet with me.
Really?
Wow. And that's like unfortunate because
you worked for a company.
Yeah, because they like were anti-business.
Really?
And so they wouldn't even talk to you, which is, I still think it's unfortunate because I think that if there was maybe a bit of a more of a collaborative push, we would have ended up with different legislation than we have like extremely high Uber prices in Seattle today. And
we do.
And like,
sheesh,
it's actually like way less drivers are getting are able to reap benefits off the platform because just way less people are using it today.
Yeah.
But in Seattle specifically. But back in the day, they just like really wouldn't listen to us in some ways. And at that point, Uber had a very deep connection with its rider base too. So it wasn't just the drivers that we were really tight with, like we were really tight with the riders as well. Did a lot of events, and we would deploy these petitions that would just flood the inboxes of city council members. And so we would get calls, be like, you have to shut it off. Like shut the emails off. We would deliver tens of thousands of emails to someone's inbox in a matter of minutes. And it was a lot of pressure from the riders to the city council members to have Uber continue. We even bought a mobile billboard that showed like no cars available. So when you open the app, if there's no car, I don't know if it's still like this to this day, but it would say no cars available if there were no cars in your vicinity. now I think that would be kind of like we all expect there to be like a ton of supply. And so we put this huge mobile billboard up calling out the city council members who weren't supporting us and saying that they were they were turning off the app essentially. And we had that circle around City Hall for like a week straight. So the city council members would like look out their window and they'd see this billboard driving by, like calling them out. And we also had, we had someone do like postering. They ended up postering some places that they weren't supposed to, like government utility boxes and stuff. But we kind of launched this huge campaign all at once. So we had like the mobile billboard going, the emails were coming in, like these posters appeared all over Seattle. We had lined up some like local celebrities, to talk about it and to retweet and repost our content. And so that really allowed us, that campaign is what kind of pushed the city to ultimately like put regulations in place that allowed Uber to continue to operate, which was pretty good. But it didn't set us up for a long-term relationship with those city council members. We were starting off in like a really big debt because we threw them under the bus pretty tough.
Do you think it was possible to do it without throwing them under the bus?
I mean, maybe, but again, I think it would have taken so long that probably not, like I don't like, there could have been like slightly different ways that we could have gone about it. But ultimately, I think that in order to create those types of like waves of change, you need to like be a little bit noisy and a bit annoying. Otherwise they just like the government isn't motivated to change. And maybe the government should be like that, right? Like if the government's too quick to change, it could actually have some like really severe consequences. In this case, obviously, like it was I think it was very necessary and is like a critical part of a transportation ecosystem.
Totally. So then I'm curious on the opposite side with any like growth hack stories you have for getting, demand up, or I mean, demand was there and supply wasn't an issue, but I'm just curious. I know you have some fun stories on.
Yeah, it was definitely like a lot of the growth was around getting supply online.
Yes.
Right. Like that was like, how do you find supply? How do you keep them online? What levers do you have to pull to get them on the road at the right time too? Because they weren't employees, right? Like we weren't telling people what to wear. We weren't telling people, hey, it's 9 a.m. You got to be on the road. Like one of the beautiful things about driving for Uber is that flexibility piece. And so that made supply hard because you had to use like a carrot method effectively of like offering incentives. And there was a lot of work done on incentive offering. And it was interesting because it varied so much by city because it depended on like what was happening in your city. And sometimes it wasn't obvious. There was like Kenny Chesney. I'm not a country music fan. Didn't know who Kenny Chesney was. No one on our team was, but every year, one of the biggest nights for Uber was the Kenny Chesney concert. But we also did early days Uber, especially the platform yielded such a fun opportunity to bring things on demand that had never been brought before. Right. So ice cream was their first take, right? So Uber ice cream. I think I ran that globally one of the years. It was so fun. They used it both. I think they decided they wanted it to be profitable that year, which in retrospect is kind of like a very operationally driven decision and not a very marketing driven decision. Like, why does it need to be profitable? It's a marketing stunt, but it was still really fun to run it globally. And like we would launch these ice cream trucks on the app for one day a year. And you'd push the button and it had a little ice cream cone, like logo on the slider. And it had the ice cream truck would roll up and it was kind of this like kind of fun tech meets real world experience. But from that, we tested a lot of different on-demand pop-ups over the years. And as cities and as regions, we had autonomy in that, which is kind of neat to think that like, we would launch things just in Seattle. Like we did an on-demand record store, not very popular, but cool, right? Like a really cool like Instagram and content piece, but not as popular as maybe I thought it would be, because I'm a dork that likes records. But one of the things that came out of it was Uber Kittens. And so Jen Joyce was she was the first marketing manager, great, amazing, like social media person. She had this idea of like filling cars with kittens, but I have this very distinct memory sitting there and envisioning like a black car full of kittens. And then you like open the door and then like kittens jump out and like
all over the city.
Now we have like dead kittens and like, this is not going to work. But we ultimately partnered with I Can Has Cheeseburger. Do you remember them? Cheeseburger, right? Yeah. They were like kind of maybe they invented like the little cat meme back in the day. We partnered with them, and then we partnered with the Humane Society, and we did Kittens on Demand. And I think the first year we did it in like 8 or 9 cities across the US. And I remember that Ryan he was like, I don't know about this, but you know, to his credit, he still gave us the thumbs up and let us do it. And it was such a crazy success. I mean, it was just a really good example of kind of on the ground marketing and how by creating content moments, you can create so much free kind of advertising and branding for yourself, right? Instead of paying money to like promote something, you're just actually like creating a magical experience for someone. Like people would call Kittens on Demand.
Yes. How did it work?
Yeah. So you'd go to the kittens option. There was like a little kitty head in the app, and you would pick it. And then, a marketing person from my team, and then someone from the animal shelter, and then someone from Cheeseburger would show up, and they would put this little like playpen up with this box of kittens. And then there was like co-branded swag you would get too. And then you just like take pictures. Most of it was offices. Right. So we'd show up to your office with this box of kittens that you get to play with for 20 minutes. And then they were all available for adoption. So if you felt deeply connected with one, you could adopt it. I
don't understand the cheeseburger association.
I was just going to say,
like, I know that like I can have cheeseburger, like cat memes, but other than that, what does that have to do?
I don't know. They were just, it was just like the woman that founded it. Emily is her name, right? She was just like, this is really cool. And I think they had it's also like co-distribution, right? This is early in Uber days. Like they had a fairly large platform and following. And so now you can cross promote, right? Like now they're promoting Uber to their entire base through this on-demand kittens pop-up. And so I think for us, that was ultimately like why. They're also good at content. And so there was some really funny content things that came out of that. But it was just a fun partnership, but I don't recall if there was like a very strategic decision there, or if it just kind of was like, yeah, that sounds really cool. Let's do that. It all like kind of folds together, and it ended up working out really well. And I think Kittens was done for a number of years. Maybe there was even globally, but definitely nationwide.
How big was Uber when you started there? Do you remember how many people?
I mean, I like less than 250.
And there was one other person in Seattle.
2 people in Seattle. Yeah.
And when you left, how big was it?
So I would say at the peak, my team was like 100 something people. By the time I left though, like we had started centralizing, right? So if you think about Uber, there was this like insane scale, like then we launched Eats too, right? And so for a time I had like an Eats GM, I had a Portland GM, we called it the Frontier. So that was like Idaho, Montana, Eastern Washington, right? We kind of had Alaska, were all part of my territory. And then we were launching Eats in those places too. And so and then I also had, because my policy issues in Washington were so much more unique, and the company saw Seattle and Washington as a critical political area, given the Teamsters integrate, like even though from a number standpoint, Seattle, like honestly, like Chinese cities were so much bigger, right? Like Seattle wasn't a huge city from a trips perspective, like LA, New York, way bigger. But it was a really interesting city politically. And so I had team members that were also devoted to I had more driver operations people than normal. I had a driver engagement team, which was really unique. We were kind of some of the first areas to really focus on the driver engagement piece. So yeah, and then from a business standpoint, I mean, the P&L was almost $1 billion by the time I left. Wow. And when I started, I can't remember exactly, but I mean, I think we were doing like 100. I remember like 170,000 when we hit $200,000 in a month. I'm like, whoa, this is huge, So it was an insane amount of growth.
When did you leave Uber?
2018.
You remember how big the company was?
I mean, Dara was CEO at that time. Probably like 8,000 people, maybe total employees. Yeah, 9.
It was a lot more than that.
Was it?
Yeah.
How many? Do you know?
I left in March of that year, and it was 18,000 at the time.
Oh yeah, see, this is in my mind. I just like make up. To me, that's really big. So, but you're right. It was like humongous. It was humongous, and I think too that for me, like I love startups. I remember I have a memory flying back from Washington, D.C., and I had spent a week writing processes to deploy processes that were going to deploy other processes, which is necessary in such a large organization, but is not that isn't what I wake up in the morning and can't wait to do. Yeah. But I think Uber, it's such a crazy process of like amazing idea, amazing product market fit, like very fast scale. Mm-hmm. And then I think though there were some struggles with retraction, right? And like creating efficiencies within an organization that really just scaled so fast. And by the time I left, my role was much less interesting than it was for the first 4 years.
Maybe that happens at every startup though, that grows like that,
I think so too.
How did you feel about the Travis ousting and the Dara arriving and that whole transition?
I think that there was a pretty large move out of Uber after that by like the original employees, because it was really sad. Like, I think that I haven't ever talked to Travis about this, so maybe his perspective is different, but my perspective is that they took advantage of his mom passing away. And I think that is really just like a shitty thing to do. I don't know. I don't like it. Like, I am fine with making hard decisions. And I think that Travis I remember having a talk with him about the internal culture, and he just didn't quite see it. And I think that there were people internally at Uber telling him that everything was okay because that's what they thought he wanted to hear. Mm-hmm. I think he got so, like, the company got so big, he became like kind of like a celebrity, right? And there was a little bit of this idea that everything was fine, and no one wanted to tell him really that there was like definite cultural problems happening internally in the company. So I'm not against the idea of having a new CEO come in to take the company public, to scale it, to make it efficient, right? Rather than a visionary company, it became like it needed to become a well-oiled machine. But I think that how it happened, my personal feeling is that it was like a kind of like a low blow, and that I wish that they could have done it in a much more respectful way, and that Travis still had a positive relationship with the company.
Mm-hmm. We might cut this out. I don't know. It's up to you. But do you remember the all hands meeting with Ariana Huffington and David Bonderman, where he got kicked off of the board that night? Do you remember this? Were you there for that? Did you?
I don't
listen to it.
I mean, I'm sure I listened to it. Okay. I remember the time.
All right.
But I don't.
You can cut this out, but I'll just tell you.
Oh, yeah. I want to know.
Yeah.
It was fucking ridiculous.
Wait, tell me.
So this guy, David Bonderman's on the board.
Yeah.
You know who he is?
Yeah.
You know who David Bonderman is?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know him personally.
I didn't know who he was. So it's on the stage. It's Travis. It's Ariana Huffington. It's David Bonderman. And this is during that transition. So we're like 2 weeks away from Travis getting kicked out. Right?
Yeah.
2 weeks before.
Yeah.
So no, it hadn't happened.
Yeah.
All company meeting about culture and whatever, all this stuff, right? Because people were having some hard times with some stuff. So anyway, Ariana Huffington gets up there and she goes, we as a leadership team, the three of us, me and Travis and David and the other people on the board, whatever, we've been talking about what it means to be a mature organization and how to lead with purpose in all these areas.
Yeah.
Huffington words,
Totally.
whatever.
Totally.
Mindfulness and leadership.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah.
whatever the hell. And anyway, and she goes, and one of the things that we were talking about is that when you have more women on the board and in leadership positions, it means you have a more diversity of opinion and thoughts about the way things should be. And David Bonderman, just for like no reason at all, picks up his mic off the floor, wasn't even on, fucking turns it on and goes, actually, what we found out is that it just means there's a lot more talking.
I remember that. I remember that moment.
I was in like the third
I remember
row.
it. I was not there. I was watching
there in
it.
person.
What the fuck? And I'm like, oh my God.
Yes.
And then, but it was like the hush of like, the hush in the crowd and the like shocked, like,
what did she do?
this is this cultural meeting about like how they're like learning to be more like, and he could have sat there and just done nothing.
And it would have been better.
And instead he's like,
you're right.
like,
I
literally,
like all the effort.
like,
let me look like a total
let me
asshole
shine
right now.
and she, to her credit, she was super classy about it. And she just looks behind her. She just goes, "Oh, David,"
Okay, she like plays it off.
And then that night, email to the whole company, David Bonderman is no longer on the board.
Yeah.
Oh my
You're right.
God.
What the fuck?
I forgot.
There was like, he could have just, I don't remember.
Why?
I
Why goes the
remember
effort?
that. I remember that now. I was not in San
You
Francisco.
remember that whole thing?
But like,
I remember talking to my friend at the time, but he's like, all he had to do was sit there and shut the fuck up and think about his billions of dollars. That's all he needed to do, and he couldn't.
and he couldn't
restrain himself.
and he had to have some kind of like demeaning. Yeah. Good
We
job,
can cut
dude.
that out if you want. I'm
Yeah.
happy to. It's up to you. It's
Okay. I don't care. I mean, you're the one that.
Yeah.
That was so ridiculous.
That's crazy.
I-
Wow. You were third row.
Yeah, I was sitting
You're
there,
like,
I was
Your
what?
jaw just dropped to the ground.
No.
Wow.
That was a tough time
Yeah.
at Uber.
Yeah.
That was a tough time. Like the delete Uber thing, like emotionally impacted my entire, like, not only did it impact the company's numbers very significantly, but like just emotionally, I think we were all very proud and excited to work at Uber.
Right.
And then that happened. And then all of that crazy Travis stuff happened. And it was like very hard. It was a very hard time. It was really sad, but it wasn't like Travis wasn't innocent in this either. Right. I remember there was a guy that worked for me, Ty. He's actually like been around the Seattle startup for a long time. He's like, Brooke, we really should like start thinking about like culture. And I remember looking at him and being like, what? Like, we don't have time for that. Like we're just like trying to like grow and like keep our head above water. And like, I have like 25 meetings today and none of them are about culture. Like, what do you mean the culture? And he was, and I think back to that moment because I remember that conversation and he was so right. Like the company was way late in defining cultural values and honestly did it in a way that felt for me in Vegas when they did the cultural values, like it was not a uplifting moment. It was we're on the, like, this is like signals the end of the cool ride. This is the end of the ride, right? Like this is the end of the train here when we went to that big Vegas party that they threw. And Uber did miss, I think it was a really, really good testament to like, you really actually, even if you're not being conscious about it, like you are creating and defining a culture, even when the company is very, very small.
Totally.
And that can get away from you really quick if you haven't been mindful about what that means to your company until it's too big. And I think they just waited way too long. I also think that the culture, while great when it was really young, wasn't sustainable. I mean, this is kind of crazy, but we had a tequila pump in our marketing office when we were in Smith Tower. And the rule was that if it was your first time meeting with us, like, so it was your first time in the office, you had to take a tequila shot.
No way.
And it didn't matter what time it was. Like, I mean, now you think about that and you're like, that's crazy. Like no one would ever, if you walked into an office and someone was like, it's your first time here, it's time to take a tequila shot. Like like you would be like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And then you'd question
Then you'd be
like the
"What?"
sanity of that. But that was how, I mean, I don't know if HQ knew about our tequila pump, but it was present and like we all used it very frequently. And so, you know, it just, that kind of culture was great when it was like it was a party, right? Like it was a big party of people work hard, play hard, I think was maybe even one of the cultural values that made it in at the end, which I think speaks to, it's just not scalable, right? Like, how do you have kids? How do you have a life? How do you do anything but that job? You know, and I think when you're at the point of 10,000 people, you need to have that diversity, right? You know, you need to have grown-ups that have children that aren't taking shots of tequila at 11 a.m.
Yeah.
So what happened after Uber? What did you do after Uber then?
Yeah.
There's a couple things between Uber and your current.
Yeah. So Uber, like, I mean, I definitely think that was like I learned more at Uber in those 5 years probably than in my entire tech career combined, right? Like, it's so crazy to think back to that time and just seeing scale. But post Uber, quit and then went and traveled, which was really fun. So my husband kind of ratcheted down some of his business, and we spent a few months in Asia, went diving out in Raja Ampat, which is like remote Indonesia, which was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. There's this place called Mosul that's like a region, but there's also a resort called Mosul. And this couple, they were divers, and they met on a date diving. I think one of them was an instructor in this area, and they had this how they tell us, they had this magical day, and it ended, they went to this beach, this like island that was unpopulated. No one was there. They pull into this bay and it's just covered in blood because it was a shark finning camp.
Whoa.
And so it was like this really big downer to this magical day they had. And so, you know, fast forward, I think it was like 15 years later, where they ended up negotiating with local people, got rights to build a resort in that bay where the shark finning camp was. And now they've preserved like thousands of acres of reef. It's no touch, no take. There used to be like dynamite fishing happening there, cyanide fishing happening in the area. And now it's one of the most diverse reefs in the entire world. They have like a ranger crew that protects it. And then the local people have found that their fishing, because they fish on the outskirts, is like up, of course, by 100x, because now they have this extremely fruitful reef that's not dying anymore from dynamite and cyanide fishing. So that was like such an amazing moment, is going and spending time there.
How long were you there for?
Just 10 days. We traveled around Asia for months, but
you went diving. Do you scuba a lot? Is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I am not. So we show up at this place. My husband is a diver because I'm like, we have to do this. And so he's a willing follower in this, but we show up, and I had watched this documentary about Mosul and was like obsessed with it, and like was just like, this is the most amazing story that these people have preserved this, and you know, just spent their life's journey, and they're actually raising their kids there now. And we show up, and I had done like 10 dives before we went there, and they're like, oh, what dive number is this? I'm like 10. And everyone else there, like, they're on dive like 5,000. This is like their bucket list location that they've been waiting to go to for like their entire life. And I just like, we just roll in, like, I don't know what we're doing.
I love that. It's like the motto.
And it was just like hilarious. And we actually met the most amazing people. Like the guy that was the head of Microsoft Singapore was there when we were there. The woman that worked for the UN in Japan, we ended up visiting later in Tokyo, was there. And then luckily they pair you with like experienced diving. So we didn't hold them back. They sent us out with a guide. And we were able to go at our own speed.
Yeah. Wow.
But to me, it's just, I think conservation, you know, the world, it opened my eyes to think about, we're in the like it took days to get to this location, but there's still trash washing up on the shores, you know, like humans have kind of touched every speck of this world. And, you know, I think if I was ever to like do a full-time job again, maybe a really cool consumer products, but also something in the conservation space, in the ocean. Like I love ocean conservation. There's something about diving with like giant manta rays that's just kind of a special moment. And then you think about them being killed. So like their gills will like help your sex life.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, you're just like, this is just atrocious, right? It's so sad. So, I traveled for a while, which was amazing. And then I did some consulting for various companies on scale, right? Like how do you scale? What is a GM? What does a profile of a GM look like? When do you start scaling? Like, I think sometimes people think that they're ready to scale, but their company's actually not quite ready to scale. So it was a lot of talking to CEOs about like, do you really need to go hire 20 GMs or do you need to hire one?
Yeah.
So one of the companies I did that for was out of Africa, which was really fun. So I got to travel a bit through Africa. And then I was approached by there was an Uber connection there, actually a political Uber connection there. They wanted to start an energy company that tracked energy usage and was able to actually give you a full profile of how green the energy you were actually burning is. So it's a company called N0. They're doing great. They have a bunch of like really interesting government contracts now. And some private contracts and some data center contracts. So I think they've added more bells and whistles now and are doing a much deeper profile of like your actual carbon footprint. But what I built for them was the hooking into the grid system and then being able to track like what energy you were actually getting at what time and then what your carbon footprint based on that energy was. It's amazing how behind the times the energy sector is in many ways. Also very scary that there's like some pitfalls in the grid, especially we were doing West Coast contracts for the most part. Like there's a few failure points of failure that you could bring like the West Coast grid offline pretty easily. And I would say the technology is very, very behind. And so it was both challenging, but also really interesting to learn about that. Like had never worked in the energy space.
Is that so far behind because it's heavily regulated? Is it just unknown to people? Like, why do you think there's this huge gap there?
You know, I think there's just like, I think that when you get into these like legacy physical systems, there's like a there's not a lot of incentive to like rebuild the technology platform sitting behind the Western grid, because it would have to be like a government investment that would come in to probably do a lot of that. It is highly, highly regulated. And the regulation varies pretty dramatically by state. So you don't have a consistent regulatory overlay, which then also makes technology more challenging. And then, it is just like a fascinatingly old system, right?
This is the weird. It's like this is like the dichotomy of regulation. It's like if it's really important, we decide we need to regulate it. We, the government, whoever decides but that necessarily means it's going to go slower.
Yeah,
it's never going to get the new stuff. Nobody's going to focus on it. It's always going to be way behind.
Yeah,
literally I don't want to be too insulting, but like not the like best and brightest. They're going to go work there, right? I was
just going to say like it's if you're like if you're the best engineer graduating out of a university, right, why are you going to take a job that you can't really change anything because it's so regulated? Right. You know, I think as I get older,
and it's like, where are my stock options? Where's the upside? My 4-star, 5-star lunches and dinners.
Yeah.
Where's the gym? Where's the coffee?
Where am I going to park my bike?
Where's the tequila pump?
Where's the tequila pump?
Yeah, it's like startup life is like attracts all these people, and then these important but so regulated that you can't innovate areas that just kind of like.
So true.
And then you need like these weird backdoor kind of entrances. The same go. The facilities are a lot like that too. I've done some like research I was doing due diligence on a startup actually, and researching them for an investment. And it was like, is linked into the back end systems of giant commercial buildings. right? And again, you find this very archaic, these like weird programming languages that were developed 30 years ago that are still running these back-end systems for these companies. And then that's quite private. It's not as regulated, but yeah, you have these older kind of legacy technology platforms sitting around. So for N0, it was called Ledger when we first did it. These guys, they were like, we want a blockchain component. I'm like, are you, it was like when blockchain was really hot. And I was like, are you sure? Like, it's really just a spreadsheet. Like, do we really need like a blockchain piece? And so they were really cool in the sense that they were really excited about what they were doing. But when I met them, I don't know if they had any documents in place at all. They just had like a lot of ideas. And so I came in and like helped them bring it all together. Like, okay, what is the product? Like, what do you want to sell? What is this? Put together their decks, business plan. And then for better or worse, I was the most technical person out of that group. And so hired engineers, I got a firm spun up and built their first product, which was actually really fun because again, it was something I had never done before. And so I think I enjoy tasks. That's like, hey, go do this. Like I feel really confident in my ability to like solve any problem that kind of someone sets forth. And so it was really fun to like build a product from scratch.
What was that company called?
N0.
Okay.
Yeah. And then actually at that point, through this time too, I had done a couple of research projects for Pioneer Square Labs. I kind of always wanted to do my own startup. And I think I envisioned this like big VC funded startup and it was going to be like amazing. And I did a few research projects for them, both on adoption and an assistant platform. But then I got pregnant and COVID hit. And so I feel like that my world kind of paused for a minute. I feel like maybe a lot of people felt that way during COVID, right? Like and then my child was born very, very early. So he was an IVF baby, but he was, at 20 weeks, they were like, oh, you're going to lose the baby. And so I went in for a procedure that was like kind of successful, but not really. And they were like, probably not. This is probably not going to result in like a live birth pregnancy. So you just have to like prepare yourself for that. Then at 24 weeks, my water broke. So that's like right for people that have kids and or that have experienced some of this stuff. That's like viability line. It's considered right around 24.
Yeah.
And most of that is due to lung development. And then luckily he was able to get steroid shots. So there's these rounds of steroids they can give unborn children that help their lungs develop faster. And then when my water broke at 24, I was admitted. So then I was in the hospital for a month, like by some miraculous, I don't know what happened, like got so lucky that he wasn't born for a month, which is really uncommon. Like 98% of babies are born like 48 hours after your water breaks. So I felt like that was actually like really, it was just all consuming and then I ultimately had the baby just before 28 weeks. And then he spent 3 months in the hospital and had like a brain hemorrhage and we had blood transfusions. I mean, it was a long path. And then we were quite worried about his development for a while. So he had some developmental delays. So I felt like my whole world was just like
totally
consumed and focused by like medical and childcare, which is odd because I never saw myself. That was never like marriage and children, though it's happened. Though I've been married twice, I'm on my have my second husband and having an amazing child. It was never like a big goal for me. I think it was really like leaving Uber and then suddenly having the space and time to raise a child that made me like really want to have kids. But definitely like the like 2021, 2022 was taken up by like
labor and consuming.
And like making sure that this child is like healthy and okay. And you know what? He's like totally fine. Now he's 3 and he's like an amazing, crazy and like developmentally totally fine. Maybe we're a little worried that he has like, his lungs are like not full capacity, but I'm like, okay, if he coughs, like maybe he has to use an inhaler. Like if that's like the worst outcome of this process,
Little miracle baby.
then like I'll take it.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a really big focus for
sure.
for a chunk of time.
So now you're doing this new thing.
Yeah. So I feel like I have like a bunch. So I have some real estate investments. Love real estate. I'm like the person that wakes up in the morning and like checks Redfin and sees like what's on the market. And I think overall I'm just like really interested in the real estate space. And I think that the real estate space is ripe for some massive disruption. Which I don't know, like, I don't think Yando is that, but Yando is a good movement. Like researching Yando has led me to this like kind of broader philosophy about the real estate space and the prop tech space. And I'm excited for it.
Did you start the company?
Yeah. So Yando, I started. What happened is I went to buy a piece of land and the real estate agent that sold it to me was like, I'm like, hey, what's going on with this land? And she's like, I don't know. And like it had bounced on and off the market quite a few times, and the owners, it was like a trust, and the guy who had bought it had passed away, and he owned like 10 properties that were all sitting in a trust, and so the children lived all over the world. There was like 6 of them. They were just liquidating his assets essentially, and they just wanted to like split the money. Yeah. So they listed this piece of land, and it immediately sold. But they didn't pay attention because they hired this terrible real estate agent. Yeah. They didn't pay attention to like what the buyers actually wanted to do with the piece of land. And so how buying land works typically is you put an offer in and then you go into like a pretty deep due diligence period with that piece of land. And then it'll ultimately you ultimately blow up the deal or it closes. It's not houses. It's way more it's way less common for a home sale to not go through once it's been in. So I found this piece of land I wanted to buy. It went pending. I was disappointed. Saw it pop back on the market. My friend was my real estate agent and my now business partner. And then he loves real estate. So he had actually got his mortgage broker license and was like selling mortgages after he had worked at Tesla and New Relic post Uber. And so I put this offer in and I just couldn't believe that the real estate agent she didn't even care. She didn't care about selling the land. It turned out that the original offer, it was a full price offer, and they wanted to put a dairy on the property. But you can't put it's zoned residential. The county was like, no, there's wetlands on it too. So it's not zoned for a dairy. So of course the sale didn't go through. Right. And if the real estate agent had just taken a moment to ask, and then the sellers were all pissed because they wanted they just wanted it sold. And then I ended up getting it for way under what they had offered it, because when something comes on the market and, goes off and then comes back on, then people are worried something's wrong with it. And it turned out, yes, there was wetlands, but they're very navigatable. Like you can build multiple houses on this property. Totally an interesting piece of land, beautiful. And I was just really shocked by the process. And so then I started interviewing other people that had bought land, and I met people one woman bought land for her religious establishment, and they lost $375,000 because there was there's a bunch of wetlands on the land and they didn't know, which a simple document review could have done. Talked to a lot of people who have built homes who didn't quite they didn't understand the cost to mitigate a slope, right? Or what kind of engineering would be needed. They didn't understand that there's multiple kinds of septic systems, and some of them are fairly cheap to install and others can get quite a bit expensive, or how deep is the well you're going to dig? What about power? How do you get that? And so we found that there's just all these problems, but as the buyer, you're expected to come in and be this expert. But most individuals are really only buying land, maybe you build your dream home once or twice, sure. And so you're expected to be this expert. So that's what we do, is we come in and are that expert for you, right? We do due diligence. It isn't necessarily, our goal is to really just be transparent with people and not we have a lot of hand holding in the process. We looked at developing tools and automations around some of this. And I think it makes perfect sense for a developer. If our ICP was a developer, But really, I love consumers and I love consumer products. And I'm like, but I don't want to build a platform for developers. I want to like help the individual. So for the most part, we just help individuals sell or buy property. Sometimes we'll come in and consult on bigger projects too. But it's all about like finding that right piece of land and then giving people a very realistic vision. Like we're trying to be as realistic as possible, not just sell them on the positives that come out of building your own house.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Okay, Yando.com.
Yeah, join Yando.com.
Join Yando.com.
Yeah. Yeah. People, if they, if someone wants help with their land or they want to sell their land, we're here to help for sure. And then I also do I do angel investing. So I like love digging into startups.
Any companies you want to talk about?
Yes. So I'm going to talk about one that I think is really cool called Yuzi. Have you guys heard of that? So it is a postpartum care. I think some of having a baby in the hospital for so long and like, as we get older and we have children, the space of, I think women's health, I also think just women's health overall as a space has been greatly overlooked, but is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Yes. And so Yuzi, in Asia, it's really common for women to go into like a postpartum center where they help you like the first time you feed your baby, right? Like the first time you change a diaper. Like our hospitals here in America, I mean, you're there for one night and then you go home. So Yuzi is a platform and like a service where postpartum you go in and you like stay in a luxury hotel room and they train you. And they help you on how to take care of your baby. Wow. But then they're also like focused on like women's nutrition. And this is like a scaled, very, very common and popular service in Asia, Korea,
I
and
read
China.
An article about this in Taiwan too.
Yep. Taiwan. Yeah. It's like commonplace that women's health and like your nutrition and stuff matters postpartum. But here it's just like no one cares. So I'm really excited. A woman named Steph launched it. Actually, it's launching next month.
Okay.
And the first cohort.
First location?
Yeah, the first location is at the Lodge at St. Edward's.
Oh yeah.
In Kenmore. If you guys haven't stayed there either, my cousin used to be the chef there. It's like really great. Yeah, it's an awesome space. My first preschool was actually on that property.
No way. I like just realized the other day that they had a hotel there.
Yeah, it's a really great. It's a really cool hotel, and I'm really excited. I'm excited for female founders to be popping up. I'm excited for the space. For the just like the postpartum care and the focus space. And so I'm excited for Steph and Yuzi. I think it'll be like, I know that they're like way oversubscribed on their first their first pilot. They're oversubscribed on their rate. They're definitely oversubscribed. I don't think she's not raising because she is like raised enough money and doesn't want any more right now. But they've seen a ton of interest and success, like massive deposits, like massive uptick, and like they can't meet. I think that's always like a really great signal, right? Is like when you can't meet the demand, then that is like an awesome signal that it's a very scalable business that's like that you should be running towards. Yeah.
It's called Yuzi.
Yeah. YUZI.
Okay. We'll be on the lookout for that.
Yeah. Check it out. Check it out for sure.
That's awesome. Brooke, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And I know I was just captivated the whole time. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Brooke. This is great.
Yeah.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Tech Out West.
Be sure to follow us on Twitter and YouTube. And of course, reach out with any ideas of who you want us to interview next at techoutwest@gmail.com. We'll see you on the next one.